Hey guys, thanks for joining us today. We believe that God's Word has the power to change lives. So grab a pen and paper and get ready for this message.
And so I said we're going to start out in John 15. And what John 15 talks about, Jesus is kind of telling a parable with his disciples and giving an example and teaching a spiritual truth here. And it's one that honestly most Christians really don't like this truth, but it's one that we all need to know. As I said, in our life, there's going to be different seasons that we go through. In our personal life, in our marriage, in our life as a church, there's different seasons. There's going to be some seasons where there's tons of fruit and new life and everything's great. There's going to be some seasons where it seems like things are dead and there's struggle and there's pain and there's heartache and all of those things. And we have to realize that's just part of life. That trials and tribulations and struggles doesn't mean that God doesn't like you. And mountaintop experiences and blessing doesn't mean that God likes you more than everybody else. There are things that we can walk in the favor of God and that type of thing. But in every life, there are seasons. Ecclesiastes talks about this, that there are seasons, that there's a time for everything, a time to die, a time to live, a time to embrace, a time to refrain from embracing, all these different things. And in our lives and in our walk with God, we have to understand the seasons of things. And this parable really kind of talks about this. And so we're going to look at this in John 15, verse 1. It says this: I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch that is in me that does not bear fruit, he takes it away, or he cuts it off. And every branch that bears fruit, look at this, he prunes it so that it will bear more fruit. And so from this real quick, I want to establish in horticultural world, there are two reasons that you cut a tree or you cut a vine. The first reason is when you see that there is no fruit. It said that when he's the vine dresser, that every branch that doesn't bear fruit, that he removes it and he throws it away. The second reason is when there is some fruit, he still cuts it away so that it can bear more fruit. And so it's the same thing, spiritually speaking, in our lives. There are two purposes for cutting. There are two purposes that God does in our lives where he cuts things out of our lives. And we're going to talk about those purposes tonight and kind of learn some lessons from it. The first purpose for cutting is for discipline. Come on, how many of you like discipline in your life? That's like the vegetable of the fruit of the Spirit. There's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, goodness. And then the last one is either translated self-control or discipline. Pastor Mark always says there's 8 fruits in one vegetable because nobody likes the discipline in their life. And discipline is not something that's fun to receive. But honestly, how many of you parents know it's not something that's fun to give? When you have to correct your child or you have to take something away from your child, it's not like you're like, oh yeah, I get to punish them now. Hey baby, let me punish them this time. No, let me. I want to do it. No, you did it last time. We don't argue over who gets to discipline our children and stuff. It's something that we don't enjoy to do. But it's something that we have to do because we know that we are going to make our children a better person. We're going to keep them safe. We're going to help protect them and learn life lessons through the discipline. And it's the same thing with God that he does. And discipline is done in the time where there are things in our life and areas of our life that don't bear any fruit. And for the most part, we kind of understand discipline. We understand that if something isn't bearing fruit, that it needs to go away, that it's kind of taking up space. We, even on rose bushes and stuff, if you start to see the little blights that come out and it's not budding, you kind of pull those things off. You cut back branches. We kind of understand this a little bit because things where there is no fruit and it's obviously dead, it's a whole lot easier for us to come to the understanding that we cut it back. Spiritually speaking, though, when God disciplines us in this area, a lot of times this cutting phase in our life isn't real deep. It's kind of the superficial changes that we make when we get saved. When we get saved, we realize that there are some things that we did before that are just not life-giving, that we need to cut out. Some of the ways we talk need to cut out. Some of our bad habits we need to cut out. The way that we treat people in traffic, we can't tell them that they're number one anymore. We got to give them the peace sign instead. I mean, just something. We know that there are some behaviors and things that we have to trim back and cut out of our life to represent Christ better in our lives. And most Christians understand the need to cut out these things in our life. But the second time when cutting is necessary in our spiritual walk with God is not as fun. The second time is something that honestly a lot of Christians never fully submit to. And that's the time of pruning. Now, pruning is a different season. Pruning gets to the very root of things. It gets to the very core of the branch or the tree or the thing. It gets a little closer to home. Listen, pruning can hurt. Anybody ever been pruned by God before? Come on, pruning is not fun. Pruning, means that sometimes there's pain, there's things that we have to let go of. Pruning means that we got to start dealing with the deeper issues that are going on in our life. We got to start addressing some of our unforgiveness and we got to start forgiving people that we've held grudges over, and we got to start, dealing with some of the rebellious attitudes that we have, or some of the pride that's in our life. God begins to just reveal different things in our life that are a little closer to home. They're a little, sometimes they're harder to let go of. Sometimes it's relationships. Sometimes it's an identity that is opposite of what God says. Just different things like that. It's a little closer to the core, and it's a little more personal. It's not simply cutting off the non-fruit branches, but it gets to the point of where it even cuts back things that are bearing fruit. I know in ministry a lot of times it'll be something that you're doing and you're actually doing it pretty well, and God says, okay, now it's time to cut that off and not do it anymore. Because you have started identifying yourself with that instead of identifying yourself as my child.
That's right. That's good.
And pruning, man, those seasons of pruning are not fun. The seasons of pruning, normally, the attack that you have in your mind and everything is, am I doing all this for nothing? I mean, everything that I do, and it seems like I can't get ahead. Nobody sees, nobody recognizes, nobody, it just seems like no matter what I do, it doesn't go right. It doesn't make sense sometimes. The discipline, we understand that we have to cut off the branches that aren't working. The pruning, to be honest, a lot of times seems completely unfair. I've been here longer. Why did they get promoted? I trained them. Why did they get that? They don't even know what they're doing. That person got full credit for the event, and I planned the entire thing, and they got the credit for it. What's up with that? You know what that's doing? It's beginning to show those issues of pride. It's beginning to show those issues of finding your self-worth in what you do instead of who you are, and more importantly, whose you are. A lot of times the pruning begins to cut back all of those things that we identify ourselves as. And God's like, that's not who you are. You're not just a worship leader. You're a child of God first. You're not a pastor. You're a child of God first. You're not just a children's worker. You're a child of God first. And he'll cut back things that seem good because he doesn't just want us to bear a little bit of fruit in that area. He wants us to bear much fruit. And here's the thing about when you cut back a tree, there's certain seasons that you have to do it in. Now, when it comes to discipline and a trimming of a tree, if we're looking at a picture of that, you can kind of do that in the spring of the year. You can do that anytime because it doesn't threaten the life of the tree. It's just kind of cosmetics. How many of you ever trimmed your bushes in the middle of in the summer or spring or whatever, when it's still full of life and everything, and you may need to go back and do it again? We got a picture here of a tree that has been trimmed. You see the first picture, the before there, and it's kind of bushy and it's kind of all out there and everything. And then the second picture, that tree looks healthier. That tree looks more defined. You can see the individual branches and everything. And that's the picture of discipline in our life. There are things that are there and our life is kind of junky. Our life is kind of full of some things. We cut them back, and then you see a healthier picture and things look great, and overall things look a whole lot better when it's just the discipline side of things. But when it's the pruning side of things, it looks like death. Put up the picture of a tree that's been pruned. Man, it looks like your 5-year-old got scissors and started cutting a chia pet's hair or something. I mean, it's like, it looks like somebody made a severe mistake with that tree. And see, here's the thing about pruning a tree is you can't prune a tree in the middle of summer. You can't prune a tree in the middle of spring. You can't prune a tree even in the fall. A tree can only be pruned in winter, which makes the pruning process even worse. Because it means the season that you are in during the pruning process, it's not just the pain of the pruning, but everything around you already seems dead and hopeless. And that's why it seems like, it's like I've already lost all of this and now you're taking this too? God, where are you? This makes no sense. Can't you go pick on somebody else? Come on, has anybody ever felt that before? You just feel like God is just cruel and mean and like everybody else is being blessed and you're being overlooked and you don't see any fruit, you don't see any hope, you don't see any change, and then something else gets cut back again. Pruning is not fun. Why would you massacre? Because that's what that looks like. Why would you massacre a tree like that? A horticulturist, this is a quote that a horticulturist said about the pruning process. It says this: the vine's ability to produce growth increases with every year. But without intensive pruning, the plant will weaken and its crop or its fruit will diminish. The mature branches, look at this, must be pruned hard to achieve the maximum yield. So in other words, the reason why you cut it back and the reason why God will bring us through a season of winter and then cut it back to where it seems like we have nothing left in our life is because he sees potential in us to bear more fruit. I remember when I was in high school, my basketball coach told me this. He said, Hawley, when I stop yelling at you, I know I've got full potential out. You know that I've got my full potential out, and I don't see anything left in you. Man, I didn't deal well with somebody screaming at me and fussing at me about stuff. But when he said that, listen, I'm in your face and I'm yelling at you because I see more inside of you, then it sparked something into me that if he sees something inside of me, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper and make sure that I give it to him. And if God looks at our life and he sees fit to bring us into a winter season and begin to cut all those things away from us, it is not a sign that God hates you and he's trying to ruin your life and he's trying to take everything from you. It is a thing that God sees more potential inside of you and he's willing to bring you into that time and cut everything back because he wants you to fulfill the maximum impact that he put you on this earth for. It's actually a sign that God believes in you and that he sees untapped potential and he wants to develop it in you. But here's the thing, if we're gonna reach that maximum yield of potential, we have to allow the pruning process. It's not automatic. And here's the problem, is not every Christian is willing to allow God to cut you back to the core so that he can bring the maximum potential. Most people, once the shears start coming out, they say it's not worth it, and they turn and go the other way. As a church, if we're gonna reach our maximum potential, there are some things that we're gonna have to cut back so that we can allow God to bring more fruit. As individuals, if we're gonna reach our maximum potential, then there's gonna be a time where we have to go through winter so that he can cut us back, so that he can bring more fruit in our life. I know people, the minute they come on staff at our Heart Church or our school, begin to experience the pruning process. Not by me, but God begins to bring them through it. And here's the thing about the pruning process, is the pruning process a lot of times looks a lot like trials. It looks a lot like heartache. It looks a lot like fire. When I said that about the water that seems like it's going to overtake you and the fire that seems like it's going to consume you and all of those things, that's exactly what it looks like. Because the adversity and the struggles is what brings forth the fruit in our life. And James wrote it this way in James chapter 1, verse 2. He said this, consider it all joy. If we have the perspective of understanding that when God cuts back, it's because he's getting ready to bring more fruit in our life, then yes, you can consider it joy, because if I can endure this pain for a period of time, then things are gonna look better, they're gonna be more fruitful in my life. But if you don't have the perspective and the understanding that the cutting back and the pruning and the pain, that there's purpose in it, and it's gonna develop stuff inside of you, and it's gonna bring fruit inside of you, then you're gonna turn and you're gonna run from it because it's easier somewhere else. Instead of embracing the season that you're in. It says, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. Know this, that the testing of your faith, that it produces endurance. And so it's producing some fruit there. And it says, let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. In other words, God is going to use the trials in your life as a test of faith, so that when you get to fight the real giants that God has called you to do, you stand fully armed and ready to fight. The reason why that David could stand in front of a giant and say, you come to me with the spear and sword, but I come to you in the name of the Lord. The birds are going to eat your flesh today. You uncircumcised Philistine, who are you to stand up against the army of the Lord? Is because David had killed the bear and David had killed the lion. God had been in a pruning process in his life, and he brought him to the point where he knew he could face this. He had endured. There was trials, there was strength, there were things being equipped in there. Every trial that we face is another opportunity for God to work in our life in an abundant way. It's an opportunity for God to show up and to reveal himself to us in a greater way. If we never had a sickness, how would we know God is our healer? If we never had a need, how would we know God is our provider? If we never had a struggle and torment, how could we know that God is a God of peace? It's in those times that we begin to learn the character of God. We begin to learn the provisions, and we begin to learn the sovereignty and the strength and the power of God, that no matter what we're facing. But here's the thing, many people try to face their struggles all by themselves, or they try to handle the issues that are going on in their own strength. And the whole time, God is waiting for you to invite him into that area. God is not a God who forces himself upon us. If we are going to see maximum fruit, then when we realize that we're in a pruning phase of our life, we have to be willing to go through it and say, okay, God, I know that you are with me. I know that you are for me. You see this struggle, and I invite you into this to move. Have you invited God into the deep, dark issues of your heart that you don't want anybody else to know about? Or are you still trying to put on the face that you put on in front of everybody else and think that you can fake out God from what's really going on the inside? Listen, he knows what's going on the inside. And he's waiting for you to invite him into the situation. How do we invite him into the situation? We hit our knees and we pray. We begin to cry out to God. The psalmist, you see this all through the Psalms. I was in this struggle and you delivered me from this struggle. I was in this cave, in this dark place, but you were the one who pulled me out. You see it time and time again, and God wants us to know him the same way. Listen, it's in the trials that God begins to show us the things in our heart that we didn't even know were in our heart. Because a lot of the stuff and the junk that is inside of us, we have pushed it down and ignored it for so many years of our life that we've convinced ourselves that it doesn't even exist. And it's not until we're put under pressure and it's not until we're put under stress that it begins to squeeze out and we begin to see those things inside of us. And like, where in the world did that come from? Listen, it didn't just show up. It's been inside of you the whole time. But you've been pushing it down and making excuses for it. We have embraced a lot of false things about ourselves that we've embraced victim mentalities. We've embraced identities as addicts, and nothing will ever change, and as not good enough, and all of these things. We've embraced those things when really we need to let go of those things, and we need to embrace the pruning phase and embrace our God and bring him into those areas so that he can bring healing to the broken places. So that he can shine light into those dark places. And he does it with pressure. He does it with trials, not lightweight things. There's many times when it talks about trials and tribulations that when you look up the Hebrew word and the Greek word for it, it means like pressed almost to the point of death. Paul said we are utterly pressed down. We are shaken together. We are in despair. We thought we were going to die. Those are the ways that he described some of those things. But yet Paul pressed through every single obstacle and everything to the point of when he's older, he's in prison, and he doesn't look at the imprisonment as a punishment, but he looks at it as an opportunity to minister to the jailers. He looks at it as an opportunity to catch up on some writing to some churches, to invest in some younger pastors. Because even in the middle of his pain, he knew he could still bring a maximum impact. It's because of him having a thorn in his flesh. Here it says he prayed that God would remove the thorn in his flesh, and God said, I'm not going to remove it. Hey, but my grace will be sufficient. and my strength would be made perfect in your weakness. It's in the hurt, in the pain, in the pruning that God reveals himself to us. In Psalm 66, the psalmist, verse 10, put it this way. It says, for you have tried me, O God, and you have refined me as silver is refined. You brought us into the net, and you laid an oppressive burden upon my loins. You made men ride over our head, and we went through the fire and we went through the water. But look at this. But yet you brought us out into a place of abundance. That word abundance there is the Hebrew word ravaya. And ravaya means this. It means saturation. It means running over. In Psalms 23, when David said, my cup overflows with the goodness, and surely the goodness and mercy will follow me every day of my life. He's talking about that peace. He's talking about that joy. He's talking about that presence of God, that he didn't just have some little chill bumps and stuff, but he had so much of the Spirit of God in his life that he was fully saturated with the Spirit of God, with the presence of God in his life. See, we think of abundance and we automatically start thinking about cars and money and wealth and all of those things. But when God thinks of abundance, he thinks about abundance of the fruit of the Spirit. He thinks about abundance of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and gentleness and goodness and faithfulness and self-control. He thinks about an abundance in strength. He thinks about an abundance of the Spirit of God in his life, of the peace of God. He thinks about an abundance of not just the presence of God, the Spirit of God, and the fruit of God, but the character of God. That when he looks at us, that we look more like his Son. I mean, that's the goal of God, is to bring us to the place where we're reaching maximum fruit. And the maximum goal is that we look more like Jesus. That we walk in the fruit of the Spirit, that our lives, that we're a light in darkness, that we see souls saved, that we see opportunities to pray for the sick and minister to people that are hurting and wounded, that we accomplish and we fulfill the plan that he wrote out for our life. Psalms 139 says, before we even lived one day, while he was intricately weaving us in our mother's womb, that he wrote out every day of our life in his book. Are you fulfilling the days that God wrote out? Or are you just fulfilling your plans? Because I can tell you this, I never planned to be crushed by God. I never was like, okay, God, today I think it'd be a good day for you to humiliate me and just bring me to the point of where I feel totally dark and want to take my life. I think today's a good day for that, God. That wasn't in my plans. But God had to bring me through days like that so that I could realize that the joy of the Lord is my strength. God had to bring me through those days to where I realized that even when it seems like everybody else has given up on me and quit on me, that God hasn't. That he loves me, that he'll never leave me and he'll never forsake me. So if pruning is so painful and all of, and extensive and all of that, how in the world do we survive pruning? John 15 gives us one way, that we abide in the vine. John 15 verse 3 says, you are already clean because of the word that I've spoken to you. But if you abide in me and I in you, then the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine. If you cut a branch off and you lay it to the ground, what's going to happen? It's going to wither and die. If you disconnect yourself from the vine, then guess what's going to happen? You're going to wither up and die. But if you stay connected to the source, if you stay connected to the vine, then the life of the vine, even though it may be cut back, will bring forth the fruit in you because the Spirit and the life of the vine is flowing into you. And it says, neither can you produce fruit unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. This is why it's so important that we don't turn back and quit. If you realize that you're in a season of pruning, if you realize that you're in a season of testing, if you realize that you're going through that, a lot of times we want to withdraw from God, and you need to do the exact opposite. You need to press into God. You need to begin to turn on some worship music and just begin to sing. It doesn't even have to be good. Scripture says make a joyful noise. Come on, is anybody glad that it says make a joyful noise instead of sing a perfect melody and pitch and tune and all that? You stay in his word. You don't just get up and read the YouVersion verse of the day, but you dig into his word until you find life. You spend time at the feet of Jesus, seeking him, allowing him to pour into you. You pray. You stay connected to church. You serve in church. You do whatever you can to be in the presence of God as much as possible. Listen, if you're in the middle of pruning, the most important thing that you can do is to cling to God with everything that you have. And I think that that's one of the big things that we're going to do going into this next year. I feel we're in a pruning stage as a church. That God's cutting some things back. And see, here's the thing. You can be intentional about the cutting back, or God would just cut it back. I would rather be intentional about the cutting back. So we're like, God, okay, what do you want to cut back? What do you want to change? And there are some things that God has told us to let go that has been bearing fruit. But that's the pruning. Do we want to bear some fruit, or do we want to bear much fruit? I want to bear much fruit. But every one of us as individuals, we need to cling in to God. We need to look at our lives and see if there's some things that we know we need to cut off. We need to embrace the season of pruning in our lives. And we need to pursue God out of desperation. I think that's one of the things that can be one of the most beautiful times, is when you're in complete despair. And we've been there. We've had death sentences on our kids. We've lost children at 15 weeks and thought that God was going to heal them and all this. And now the baby's gone. We faced heartaches, and people who were supposed to be with us turned their back on us and walk away, and rejection. We faced all of those things. But in those seasons when it seemed like everything else was going wrong, I remember some of the most amazing encounters with God. Times just on the floor in the living room, just saying, God, this ain't never going to happen. We just need to quit. But God, I know what you're telling me. So I don't need to quit. I just need you. Just get to the point. It's like, God, I need a better job. I need this. I need you to straighten out my wife. She's getting on my nerves. My kids are driving me crazy. My boss, you need to deliver me from my boss. Instead of asking God for all of these things, and just get to the place of saying, God, I need you, God. If I never get the child, I need you. If I never get the promotion, I need you. If I never get to preach a message, if I never lead a song, if I never write the book, if I never do any of those things, I just need you. And it's in that pruning phase that God begins to work. And it says this in Romans 8. It says, God is able to work all things together for the good of those who love the Lord and who are called according to his purpose. For whom he foreknew, he predestined that they would be conformed into the image of his Son. In other words, when you're in the middle of all those storms, when you're in the middle of all those trials, just know something. That God is making you look more like Jesus. His desire is that Jesus would be the firstborn among many brethren. God's desire wasn't that you would just receive him as your Savior. God's desire was that you would invite him as your Lord, and you'd let him change you to look more like his Son so that you could reach and fulfill your maximum impact. And he goes on. It says, for the ones who he predestined, he also called. The ones he called, he justified. The ones he justified, he glorified. So what shall we say of these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? And I'm going to tell you right now, the first thing that the enemy is going to try to do is convince you that the pain and the heartache and the struggle and the trial is a sign that God is mad at you and he's not for you. But let me tell you something. God promised that he wouldn't leave us and he'd never forsake us. That if we're in the valley, he's with us. If we're in the water, he's with us. If we're in the fire, he's with us. Wherever we are, then God is right there with us. And remember this, love this. If God is for us, who can be against us? But verse 32, remember, he did not spare his own Son, but he delivered him over for us. If he did that, then how will he not also give freely to us all things? Who can separate us from the love of Christ? Will tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? But in all of these things we overwhelmingly conquer through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither life nor death nor angels or principalities or things present or things to come or powers or height or depth or any other created thing. I think Paul was just like, okay, I want to make sure that they understand this. There is nothing. Turn to your neighbor and say nothing. Nothing. No circumstance, no trial, no heartache, no amount of winter, no amount of pruning, nothing can separate you from the love of God. Your circumstances can't separate you from the love of God. Pruning can't separate you from the love of God. It's actually a sign of his love, because he wants to see you hit your maximum impact. So if you're in a pruning stage right now, realize it's because God sees potential in you. It's because he loves you. It's because he's doing a work inside of you to strengthen you, to develop character in you, to bring healing to those dark and broken places, so that you'll be able to hit the high mark of the calling that Christ Jesus has on your life. I'm telling you, it's worth every bit of pain. When you begin to see God unfold your dreams in front of you, you forget all the pain. It's kind of like that mama who's been in labor for 24 hours and pushing through that pain. The minute they hold that little baby, it's not like they're like, you weren't worth it. It could be the ugliest little baby, cone head and all. I had one kid, I looked at it, I was like, oh man. Was stuck in the birth canal a little bit, had that, just saying. I'm being real here, all right? Melody was like, oh, it's the most beautiful thing. I'm like, are you looking at the same baby I am? Put that hat on that child. I am pleased to say that God rounded out the head and it was all good. Guys, it's worth it. I'm asking you to take this journey with me. To be willing to have things cut back in our life. To be willing to do a self-evaluation of our heart. And to dig in and press into God and make sure that we're abiding in him. Because it goes on in that John 15, it says, if you abide in me and my word abides in you, you can ask whatever you want and I'll give it to you. I want to get to the place where God, I look so much like Jesus in my life that God says, okay, whatever you want, I'm going to give it to you because I know you're not going to ask for anything about you. I know that you're not going to do it for your fame or your glory or your wealth or anything like that because I have tested you and tried you to the point of where I can trust you to ask whatever you want. And I know it's going to be according to my will. I want to be there. And it comes in the season of winter, in the season of pruning, by allowing him in those dark areas.
Again, thanks so much for tuning in today. We hope that you've enjoyed this message and that you felt the presence of God right where you are. If you did enjoy it, we'd love to see you live at one of our campuses. Mount Hope meets at 9, 11, and 5, and Summersville meets at 11. We'll see you there.